All right, folks, let's get started. Everyone can hear me okay? Yeah. All right. Well, thank you for coming to this special public event, Fantastic Worlds, a cartographic exploration of the works of fantasy mapmaker Karen Wynn Fonstad. My name is Robert Roth. I am a professor here in the university in the Department of Geography, and I teach the cartography classes. So maps, maps, maps all the time, right? And I want to welcome you on behalf of the department, on behalf of all of the program organizers to Historic Science Hall. This is probably the last summer lecture we'll have in this building until it's renovated. And so you're the last people to join all of the student sweat equity that has been here for the last 100 or so years. Our department, 150. The building's 150 years old. Our department's been here for the last 100 years. This has been our home. I just want to signal to start after the public part of the talk. We're going to be going to the Robinson Map Library, which is on the 3rd floor. There is an elevator on the way up to the Robinson Map Library. And so if there's not enough time for conversation, please find Mark, find us in the map library afterward. And just for a little bit of context, Arthur Robinson, the namesake for the map library, is often considered the kind of grandfather or the dean of modern cartography. He was a World War II hero who then set up cartography as kind of a scientific discipline after that experience. And so thinking over the course of 100 years, not only is this a historic building, but our department often is ranked in kind of the top 2 or 3 geography departments in the nation worldwide. I'll say Oregon also is often up there as well. So I'm just a great sometimes they steal our students. Yeah, a great place to talk maps, I think, right? Okay, so I was asked to give a general introduction to what is cartography and what is map making. When I speak to a more public, broad audience, I always get the question, hasn't everywhere been mapped already, right? And so the quick response is that the world is extremely complex and dynamic, right? And maps are models, they're tools that helps us understand, make sense of this complexity. And so while everywhere is probably mapped in some way, certainly not everything, and how fast changing the world is today, we have to constantly be remapping, right? So great job security if you want to become a geographer or cartographer. Thinking about profession, our GIS professional programs ran a market study last year to just sort of see what is the scale of the geospatial industry. We estimated that there's 850,000 Americans working in cartography, GIS, geography, remote sensing today. And that number worldwide is over 2 million. And so it's a huge part of our workforce, a huge part of our footprint. It's just we don't teach a lot of geography in K-12. And so often I say it's kind of the best kept secret on campus for finding jobs, right? And so for all the kiddos out there, use this as inspiration. You can be a fantasy map maker and get paid for it as well, which is great. I also want to know almost everything my whole spiel about the workforce, but one of the facts that I think is really relevant to today, the U.S. World and News Report always comes out with kind of these, how are the marketplace for different professions, how are things growing, expanding, and they listed cartographer as the engineering jobs, kind of data science job with the lowest stress, so the lowest work stress, and the highest satisfaction. And I always kind of point that out to students because that is really important to kind of love what you do. And I think it's because every 2 to 3 weeks, cartographers are in a different place, right? They get to research a different geography. And it's a profession that kind of encourages creativity and just curiosity throughout your career. And so it's, I think, refreshing compared to a lot of other professions that are a little bit more mundane out there. So thinking about cartographers, one point I want to get across is that it doesn't really matter if we're mapping Earth or Middle Earth. These maps really serve the same purpose, right? Maps root stories in place. And so they give the settings to our lives. And when we think about books, it's really helpful to understand those settings, to spatialize them, to know kind of the full flow of the characters in the plot. It also they allow us to ponder the true scale of the real or imaginary worlds and the things in it, right? And so I always love the Lord of the Rings maps because I could see sort of the full journey, right? It was all there. And then I could imagine myself inside of that world. Maps also help us consider alternatives. And so they don't just show us how the world is, but they help us think about how it might be or how it ought to be. And that's where I think literary maps play a really important purpose of considering these alternatives, and maybe literature generally and fiction generally. where through this imaginative power, we can grapple with really difficult, complex social and environmental interactions, right? We don't have to be arguing about real places or real people, right? So they give us this really great sandbox to think geographically, right, in kind of a low risk standpoint. So my line here that I really want to say, whether real or imaginary, maps always transport us to the most fantastic of worlds. Okay, so this brings us to the point, the reason why you're all here, not for me, but to celebrate the work of Karen Wynn Fonstad. And I'm going to let our speaker introduce Karen and provide her biography, but it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker, her son, Dr. Mark Fonstad. So you might have seen Mark profiled recently on Wisconsin Public Radio. Maybe that's why you came here for this event. In Mark's typical day job, he is an associate professor in the University of Oregon. And again, another great geography department. I think it's, especially in cartography, one of the top three. And I joke with my colleagues that the only reason we let Oregon in the Big Ten is to get their cartography program as part of our network. Before he joined the University of Oregon, he received a PhD from Arizona State University. But more importantly, just like myself, he received a Bachelor of Science in Geography from this department, the University of Wisconsin Department of Geography. Yeah, go Badgers, right? Maybe even more importantly to the folks who are gathered here right now is that Mark also holds degrees from 3 additional Wisconsin schools. Lareders Academy High School, St. Peter's Junior High, and Reed Elementary, all in Oshkosh, Wisconsin. So you're seeing the perspectives the world has created by Wisconsin citizens, right? By Wisconsin cartographers, by Wisconsin geographers. And so again, for the kids out there, please talk to us about our mapping programs. You can do what you're seeing up here for a living. Like this could be your life, right? Since leading all these great Wisconsin programs, Mark has become a prolific scholar in his own right, and so definitely using that great Wisconsin education. It contributes to the topics of geomorphology, hydrology, remote sensing, and environmental simulation. And I had to count up your CV. Mark has written over 60 academic papers and book chapters. And so one of kind of really great prolific peers, and certainly an amazing alum of our department. And I'll end on this, but Mark has just a great reputation of being a really remarkable colleague. I actually visited Oregon last October while I was on sabbatical, had a great visit that Mark helped host. And I think on behalf of the organizers, we all just really appreciated the time with you over the course of this month and early in the year. It's been, I think, really a great honor to be able to host you here. So with that said, please join me in welcoming back Wisconsin Department of Geography alumni, Dr. Mark Fonstad. Mark, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Rob, and thank you to all of you for allowing me to come back. This is, I think the last time I gave a talk in this room was 2018, the Yifutuan talk, and I'm beginning to think that this may be the very last time that I speak in the room that I recognize for the last 3 decades or more. But you're not here to hear me talk about that. Before I begin, however, if we can, why is this not advancing? There we go. So I do want to do just a quick shout out to everybody who has been helping on the show. That's many of whom are here tonight. First of all, the show is sponsored and organized by a whole bunch of people in different organizations related to one another. Department of Geography. I'd like to thank the map library upstairs, the Robinson Map Library, the UW Cartography Lab, which Rob runs, for example, and the UW GS Professional Programs. There are an enormous number of opportunities for mapping in this university. And if you're interested in mapping in any way, these are your contact points. And in addition, I've had a number of individuals that I've been really fortunate to work with over the past couple of months, even more, to make the show possible. It turned out to be, quite a fair bit of work, but things are going well. So Janelle, Jamie, Alicia, Robert, sorry, Bob, and Bill. They, stole from Oregon. Let's see. In addition, we have some resources. If you are interested in more, if you go to Instagram, go to the UW-Madison Geography on Instagram. I've just been showed that if you go to Instagram there and click on the video, somebody today or yesterday or somebody went up there and like shot this whole video going around the map room. Like, that's cool. I didn't even know that was happening. So, things are good. Same thing on Facebook and also LinkedIn. Okay. I'm aware that you're really not here to get a whole bunch of me talking. What you really want to do is see maps. So what I want to do is do a little bit of biography of Karen Wynn Fonstad, who is my mother. And after we do the bio and show a little bit about what you are going to see or maybe have seen, we will have time for questions. And then after that, we will adjourn upstairs where the map library will be open and all the maps will be on display. I say all the maps, but actually only about 5 or 10% of all the maps are on display because there are too many. There are hundreds of maps. And so I'm lucky to have a space upstairs that I can show even a small fraction of them all. So Karen Wynn Fonstad was born in Norman, Oklahoma, and she always was interested in art. She thought she was going to be a art major. By the way, before I get going, Karen's 2 sisters and her husband Todd and her daughter Christy, her son Mark are all here. So if you want to bug them about details, that's why they're here. So she was very interested in art. The thing is that when she was about to be university age, it was the 60s. And art in the 60s was like pop art, like Andy Warhol, and it was abstract expressionism. That was not what she was into. She was into representational art. And that just was not what was going on. So she ended up being a physical therapy major. And she did physical therapy off and on. Throughout her life, but she was also still interested in art, and a university professor actually offered her a contract job. Can you do this map for me? And she did that, and she enjoyed it. And one of the geography department faculty suggested she become a master's student in geography and do cartography. And she did that. And she was one of the very first women in the geography program at the University of Oklahoma. And while she was there, she TA'd. She was a teaching assistant for cartography, which was, by the way, the first time she had ever seen a map of Middle Earth. She had no idea what it was. She also met my father there, who was also a graduate student. After he was a PhD student, so after they were married, my father got a job at the University of Wisconsin Oshkosh, and they moved to Oshkosh, where they lived for a long time, decades, and where he taught and she occasionally taught, and where she made maps. While she was at the University of Oklahoma, she did a master's thesis on a topic which turned out to be really useful for her, because the topic of her thesis was guidelines for preparing maps for manuscripts. And so what she did was she sent surveys to professional map makers around the United States, like people working for National Geographic and basically asked them a whole bunch of questions about how do you represent this? How do you represent that? And she accumulated those findings. And so what her thesis represents is a kind of snapshot of the middle 20th century cartographic standards. And if you go upstairs and look at the maps that she drew, what you're seeing is not the kind of maps that you would have seen in 1420. They're not medieval maps. They're fantasy places, but they're done in a kind of mid-century modern approach. And I've always wondered if that's maybe why people tend to think of them as real. I don't know. And who knows, our views on what are real ways of representing change through time. Today, maybe to have your map thing appear real, maybe it has to look like Google Earth or Google Maps, or I don't know. There are a couple of predecessors to her work that you will see very obviously come out of her maps. This map is a very famous map. Do we have any geographers in here? Yeah. Does anyone recognize this map? Yeah. Who did this? Yes. So this is a very famous map by Royce, Irwin Royce. It is the physiography or the topography of the United States. And if you look at this map, it has different areas of the US depicted with different kinds of relief symbols. And this looks very similar to like the Atlas of Middle Earth, right? So that's an example. Here is a more three-dimensional kind of diagram by a guy named Armin Lobeck, who I think was actually a professor in this department way back in like the 30s. And you might think, well, that's not really a map, but it is, actually. It is a three-dimensional representation. You can think of it as a map that's been tilted down. And you will see examples of her work that looks very, very much like this. So her techniques were modernist in their approach in many ways, even though she was working on fantasy maps. Now, since we're here to talk about fantasy maps, we should talk about Tolkien for a moment. She was a graduate student teaching assistant in cartography. One of the students there was trying to do a map of Middle Earth, Tolkien's Middle Earth. He apparently was not a particularly good student, didn't finish their map, but she had no idea what this was, but she was very interested in it. And later on, a friend of hers that she was visiting had the very first book of Middle Earth, the Fellowship of the Ring. And she borrowed it, read it straight through, immediately read the others, and she loved it. I think she ended up reading those books of the Lord of the Rings maybe 30 or 40 times. And one of the things that Tolkien is famous for, beyond just his story, is he used literary maps. In other words, he had his own maps in the books, and he also had characters in his stories sometimes refer to maps. Tolkien was not a geographer, but he had a pretty good world building approach. He took places in his own life and kind of used them as templates for his fantasy worlds. He usually took real world places and kind of made them slightly more dynamic. So the Alps, but a little bit more, or the hills of southern England, but like a little more, and so on. You see that, and which is why I think it was a great idea for Peter Jackson to film in New Zealand, which is like England, but a little more. He also hand drew some of his own maps, but with a couple of exceptions, the actual maps in his books were penned by his son, Christopher Tolkien. And occasionally he worked with an illustrator as well, Pauline Bayes, who did this colored version of Middle Earth. So there is a whole long history of people making maps of Middle Earth. But the thing was, by the way, Tolkien died in 1972 or 3, somewhere around that. And my mother had this idea that she would make a huge map of Middle Earth, one big map that you put on a wall or something. But the more she thought about it, the more complicated such a map would have to be to have everything on it that would be of interest to people. And the maps that Tolkien made they were big, but they didn't have any detail, basically no detail. So for example, here's the map that's in The Hobbit, right? It's the Lonely Mountain up there. It's very little detail. And even when they tried to do something detailed, so this is the northwest corner of Mordor, and also down here at Ilion and where Minas Tirith is, there's very little detail. Because otherwise it would have taken Tolkien a long, long time. He was not a cartographer. So my mother thought, wouldn't it be great if we had a huge map that had everything on it? But the more she thought, the more difficult it would be. And then in 1977 or 78, Christopher Tolkien published The Silmarillion, which was a long-awaited book of Tolkien stories that he had written all the way back to almost World War I. And everything changed because this was an enormous world building exercise, the Silmarillion. And it also became clear after having read it very quickly to my mother, it meant that there was no way you could ever put everything on one map. In fact, even the world changes. So she decided, we're in geography. That's why we have atlases. Companion annotated atlases for fantasy worlds really never existed before 1980 or 81. You see individual maps and so on instead. So the idea of having an atlas was new, and she thought maybe somebody would buy this if I were to make it. So she went to Houghton Mifflin, the publisher of Tolkien's works, and said, "Can I talk to a specialist?" And as it turns out, the specialist who had worked with Tolkien herself directly, although she was retired, was there that day. My mother basically cold called, talked to this woman. The woman loved it. Back and forth a little bit. She got the okay to do it. It's like a Hollywood ingenue walking off and getting a role. Like she had never done any very much professional work otherwise. I'm not going to spend a huge amount of time talking about how she did her work. I will show you a little bit about how the cartography world worked before the digital revolution. First of all, probably almost half of all the work of producing fantasy atlases is reading the books over and over so that you build up mental maps of places in your head. And if you want to go beyond that, what you have to do is go through the text, and every time an author puts down like some information about geography, like that hill was over there, or they went to the left and not the right, every time you underline it. And then you type it into your database, you get a big, huge database that you can then sort. Okay, what are the bits of information about this part of the world, or all the bits of information about how they went that way? It's enormous research. You have to do research before you can make the maps, because otherwise the maps you make will not be real with the text. Like those two have to go together. So huge amount of work actually just reading through the text. And after you do that, you have to work to put mental maps in your head to build up what would a map look like that would be good with the text and also consistent with the world that the author has made. So in the case of Tolkien, Tolkien was thinking about real places, but a little bit more. So what can I do to make a map that is like a little bit more than the Rice map or Lowback or something that you would see in actual like England? So you start with one big map, not a very detailed map. This is in cartography called a base map. We still use this idea in modern digital cartography. It's a map that does not show much detail, but it shows very basic things. Where is there land versus water? Where are there mountains? Where are there rivers? And this is a big, huge base map. You'll see it if you go upstairs. In fact, big enough that it would never fit on a map table. So she went down to the kitchen where they had kitchen tiles and marked off with these squares for the kitchen tiles. And that's how the Atlas of Middle-earth started, was kitchen tile map. You then take this map is in pretty rough shape because, it was on the kitchen floor. Then you go back upstairs to the light table, to the mapping table, and you do it again, but this time with ink, so that you can actually see what's going on. And this becomes the base. If you want to then do something way more detailed over here, like Mordor, then you take a little piece of this map and you blow it up and you recopy everything over so that you can start fresh to make a new map that's more detailed. And then you do it again for this area, and you do it again for this area. It's not like today where you just push a button and zoop. That didn't exist then. Everything had to be hand redone. In fact, enlarging, reducing photocopiers didn't even come into use until the 80s. So, I can't even imagine the amount of work it took. But at the end of the day, what you end up with are maps that are made of different layers. We've got this base layer that's underneath, and then we have layers that show tinting for water or for a land cover or something else. and we have text and topography. They're built up like layers like you'd use in Photoshop. Except these are actual physical layers. And when you go upstairs, you will see these layers. At that point, these maps of layers are then sent to the publisher, and she would make notes on the maps that say, wherever I have red, use such and such a screen. Use, for this kind of color, use this screen, because in almost none of her work is there full color because it would have been way too expensive. And as a result, you have to tell the printers what to actually do with your work. So what you end up with are atlases that have a mix. Some are maps showing really, really big areas. Some are maps that show really, really small areas. And sometimes they get to be almost more like artistic or architectural than they are like pure maps. These two are pure maps. That one is Bag End. Okay, both of these are from Atlas of Middle Earth. This one is the Morannon, which is the Black Gate to Mordor. Here's a couple of pictures of her actually working on the first edition of the Atlas of Middle Earth, which was published in 1981. At that time, the only texts she had to work with were The Hobbit, The Lord of the Rings, and the Silmarillion. And what you end up with are dozens and dozens of these kinds of maps. They're roughly this big. And depending on whether the map is supposed to be 2-page spread or 1 page, you would cut this thing up into different sizes so that the printers can make either a big map or a small map. A lot of work, 2.5 years. She finished ahead of schedule, except just as she finished, Christopher Tolkien decided that would be a good time to publish the Unfinished Tales, almost the same size as the Silmarillion. And there were certain things in the Unfinished Tales that did not exist before, like the Island of Numenor map. So she had tried to guess what the map might look like, but she didn't know. Christopher Tolkien had access to J.R.R. Tolkien's work, so she had to go ask permission to go back in and redo some of the maps all over again, including Numenor. So if you go to the Atlas of Middle Earth, you'll see a map that looks very much similar to the Unfinished Tales because she had to do it all over again. So probably the only time I've ever heard somebody of finishing their book early and late for it. So the book was published in 1981, and it was received very well. Both the public liked it, bought it, and it was critically quite well received. Christopher Tolkien himself was very happy with it, and he was a kind of a guy who wasn't always happy with things that were Tolkien related. And he basically said it is kind of amazing that such a professional level book is actually in print, by a professional cartographer. He said, if there is enough readership for such a book to make it into publication, maybe there are enough readers of Tolkien to make it worth my while to publish what became later the History of Middle-earth series, the whole series of books of the bits and pieces that his father had written over many decades. Houghton Mifflin agreed to that and thus started a waterfall of new Tolkien-related publications all the way into the 1990s. In the meantime, my mother still wanted to do more work, so she contacted and had a good relationship with Judy Lynn Del Rey. Del Rey was a publisher that is now part of Ballantine, and they published other fantasy worlds. And she said, there are 2 authors that you might consider further atlases. One of them is Anne McCaffrey, who published the Pern novels, The Dragon Riders, and the other is Stephen Donaldson, who published the Chronicles of Thomas Covenant, which we also call The Land. And so over the next 3 or 4 years, she produced those 2 atlases. I went with my mother to Ireland in the early 80s so she could work with Anne McCaffrey, who's at the top here. As part of her work, she didn't do anything super different from when she had done the Atlas of Middle Earth. The only difference is that the author was still alive. And so it's nice to be able to go and ask questions when you couldn't do that with Tolkien. After Pern was published, She did the Atlas of the Land. Stephen Donaldson, who is still alive, is a kind of a recluse, but he was willing to work with her in person. So my family drove this VW van that we spent years in down to Santa Fe, where he lives, so she could work with him. The maps that are produced, again, start out as pencil drawings, right? If you like just drawing, pencil sketching, that's how real professional maps often start. They are from the mind, before a computer, before anything else. They start as pencil drawings. And this pencil drawing is from these are from Pern. You don't always have to do just maps, right? Pern, for example, is a set of books that includes lots and lots about dragons. So you get to do taxonomic drawings, like dragon wings. What other book are you going to do? Dragon wings? You get to do interiors like caves and caverns and full-on planets. The Atlas of Pern was published, I think, around 1984. Also did well. The Atlas of the Land came afterward in 1985. At that time, Judy Lynn Del Rey died, and my mother was looking for other opportunities. And as it turns out, also here in Wisconsin was a very famous, well-known company known as TSR, who published Dungeons and Dragons. Today, they're known as Wizards of the Coast. They're in Seattle, but at the time, they were in Wisconsin. And they were interested in having her do atlases for two of their works, the Dragonlance and the Forgotten Realms series that were both published by TSR. This is Margaret Weiss on the left and Tracy Hickman on the right. My brain. Right, here are some pictures from Dragonlance. More art, more maps. She loved being, besides the Tolkien Atlas, the publishers of the Tolkien Atlas kind of gave her a restriction. Don't do a lot of 3D. They really wanted top-down maps, which is fine for most things, but she felt restricted by that. So when she did further on maps, you can see through her life, those maps getting more and more complicated. And you could do big global maps, you can do 3D maps. Here's some from the Forgotten Realms. She even experimented with color, although that didn't end up happening with this book. And by the time we get to about 1990 or 89, so many extra things had been published in Tolkien's world, all the history of Tolkien, that there were things wrong in the original Atlas of Middle-earth. So she asked Houghton Mifflin if they would allow her to do a revision. And they said, yes, we will allow you to redo about a quarter of the Atlas. And so she got to sneak in new techniques like 3D landscapes of Minas Tirith. If you go to the store today and buy the Atlas of Middle-earth, you will see what was done about 1991. One of the things that was new was at that time, the history of Middle-earth went into a lot more depth about the early history of Middle-earth. It talked about the nature of the world, how it had changed, a lot more detail. And so she spent a lot more time redoing maps from earlier ages before Lord of the Rings, before The Hobbit. That's the part of the Atlas that changed most. The revised Atlas of Middle-earth was published basically at the exact same time as Tolkien's 100th birthday. Of course, he had died in the 70s, but it was kind of a big, important time. And between 1991 and her death in 2005, things got very, very exciting because, as you probably know, Peter Jackson made some little films that a couple of people have seen. And as it turns out, so the guy on the left is Alan Lee. He's well known. He was the lead artist on Peter Jackson's films. And he and John Howe, the main artists, worked with the set designers and the scouting people on the movies to go find places that they could film. And the thing that they took with them to find the good places was the Atlas of Middle-earth. So he was like, we used your Atlas all the time, which that made my mother's, day. And so she was, She was interviewed for some of the DVD sets for Lord of the Rings after they came out, and she gets to have Sean Astin and other people sign her books. So that's always good. In the 1990s, she sort of slowed down, didn't do more atlases. She tried to get publishers interested in things. She spent a lot of time trying to get permission to do an atlas of Narnia. The C.S. Lewis estate decided that they really didn't want her to do it. But in the meantime, she had done a lot. So she had done several maps, she had written chapters. And so if you go upstairs, you will see some of the Atlas of Narnia that no one has ever seen because it was never published. And she was going to do full color so that publishers would use color separation. This is in the age right before the internet, and she spent a whole bunch of time figuring, okay, who are the main publishers? What are their phone numbers? What are the contacts? Like if you've heard like what artists spend their time doing, well, this is the same thing. But she was very, very motivated in her life. She was not a patient person, always trying to do stuff. She served on the city council and, as if she didn't have enough to do. And she contracted breast cancer. And in the 2000s, she kind of went back and forth with her cancer. And this is at the time the movies were coming out. She managed to make it through all the movies, the Lord of the Rings movies, not The Hobbit. And one of the things that kept her motivated at the time was that there was a community of women at the time that the movies were coming out that became known as the AON Challenge. These are women who set up, we want to be responsible for our own health. We want to walk each day and do certain things each day. And they asked my mother if she would be willing to help out by figuring out the mileages from one place to another all over Middle Earth. And she loved that idea. And last week or a couple of weeks ago, I went through all her documents and I found dozens of pages of calculations. And, it's like somebody's calculations to go to the moon or something. And you can still today go to their website and see how long it would take you to go from A to B if you're going to go from, I don't know, Bag End to Rivendell. Okay, that's all I'm going to say about my mother. Just a couple last little bits before we go upstairs. The idea of literary maps, of fantasy maps actually, is very old, much older than Tolkien. For example, on the left is a map from Gulliver's Travels. And on the right, from William Morris's The Sundering Flood. Like these are very much like Tolkien's maps. That concept is almost like a base human idea, right? And so even today, there are people that, for no reason other than they enjoy it, building their own realities around them. This one always amazes me. This is a guy who, for decades, at every lunch hour from his job, he would paint. He would use cards to figure out one bit of this map that grew and grew and grew for his whole life. Like people love making fantasy maps. There are far more fantasy maps being made today than ever before, partly because we have software and other things that make it methodologically easier. Is it escapism? Well, I suppose it is, but that's okay. Yi-Fu Tuan was a very famous geographer, and in this very building, he wrote a book called Escapism. And one thing that you can say from that book is, what cultural product is not escapism? Okay. One last thing. What will you see when you go upstairs? So this is upstairs in the map library. You're going to see all these tables with dozens, hundreds of maps all over the place. You're going to see some panels that show some details about my mother, my family back there. If you want to bug them about things, you'll see a little bit about places that have never been published, like Narnia. Another thing you'll see is different parts to her process. Like we're going to make the map in pencil first, and then we're going to ink it and so on in order to get to the final publication. In other words, what you're going to see is what you can't see in the atlases. What you can't see is the process of it actually happening. And with that, I think that's enough time. Thank you, everyone.
Awesome, thank you, Mark. I think we have time for a few questions, and again, we'll have a chance to be able to talk more upstairs. But I do want to allow maybe questions. Yeah, and I'll wrap up with like. What are the plans for the long-term vision?
It's interesting that you mentioned that question. What are the long-term plans for distribution of the archive? There's nothing official yet. I will say that there are some people here today from the American Geographical Society Library in Milwaukee who might help with that question. Maybe, hopefully. Yes, please.
Any questions?
How was her work perceived by professional cartographers while she was working on fantasy?
Yes.
And did that perception change as the mouse, that famous mouse, became more popular?
So that's a great question. Basically, the question is, what did other professional cartographers think of her work while she was alive and doing them? The starting part of that question is she often said that she was like on a desert island. She was basically, I don't want to say she was never an introvert, but she was the one person dealing with her maps. And so she was happy when they were published and people would say it's good or so on. And she interacted with many people who loved it, but she wasn't going to conferences or anything else to interact with photographers really. Only occasionally would she do that, very much. That started to change late in her life. Around the time of Peter Jackson's movies, in the last few years of her life, she started to kind of open up and go to, you know, the conventions and everything else. And at that point, I think she started to realize that she was a bit of a pop star. And I think she would be stunned by what people think of her today. Or at least I think she would feel gratified that people liked her maps. Yeah, great question. Others?
Getting my steps in.
Click, shut.
All right, you should photographer.
You have a particular map that you would have liked to put in the display today? Because I know you said it only saw.
Yeah.
Of the map.
Do I have a map that I wish I could have put on display that I couldn't? I wish I could have put every single map on display. You know, I'm looking into the future. I don't think it'll be too long before we will have virtual reality spaces where I could put every single map up and we could walk around. We're close to that point. But to answer your questions directly, no, I think I was able to put a lot of the maps that I really wanted to put up there. Thank you.
What was your favorite character?
What were her favorite characters? I think she liked the hobbits. You know, I think she was 5'1". She wanted to live in Baghdad. I think she liked the hobbits. Yeah. Yeah.
Why did she prefer fantasy to real world stuff?
Yeah. That's a great question. I don't know the answer to that. But she constantly read fantasy and science fiction. I think that was just her favorite. You know, like we go to the movies. Do you like superhero movies? Do you like mysteries? Do you like horror? And she liked fantasy. And you know, I'm never really sure why we like the things we like.
Okay. Close enough.
Yeah.
Okay, oh, I have 2 questions. I saw 2 hands come up.
Did Karen have a favorite map that she referred to, and also do you have a favorite map?
Yeah. I'm afraid I don't know the answer when it comes to my mother, if she had a favorite map. There were many maps in the Atlas of Middle Earth that she really liked. She does have a portfolio upstairs that are kind of, I think, her favorites. Like one of them is the Misty Mountains in Middle Earth. For me, the thing that I think of probably more than any are the base maps because I've lived with them. I grew up right next to them. Yeah,
Right, you know, it's not in here, so this will be our last question.
I'm dripping. I'm a river scientist, but you know, it's not that.
Oh, first off, if you said that, do you have anything from your childhood that growing up in this that you feel like it's worth it? Eventual Boston career is a little bit all just the geographer.
So there may have been a picture here, I can't remember. We traveled around all the time in a VW van. You know, it sounds very 1970s, but we traveled from New Mexico to Newfoundland. And for a geographer, there is no better training than seeing things. And I feel extremely fortunate that I was able to have, we weren't rich or whatever, but we had a little bit of time. And that was just so fortunate. I feel so fortunate for that. That's what I mostly remember. Thank you, everyone.
Yeah,
Much appreciated.
Dr. Fonstad.